Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. This is your host, Ruffin. I have a super exciting guest with us today, Herrera. She's a venture capital investor with Knight Ventures. And if you don't know it, that is Mr. Beast venture arm. Before Knight Ventures, dropped out of Northeastern to pursue an opportunity with BVG Ventures and then Harlem Capital. She's also building the Wirus. It's a student startup network for women founders and investors. M's background is incredibly impressive. I loved every minute of our conversation, and I'm so excited to share it. Hi,
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. It's nice to meet you.
It's so nice to meet you too. Where are you calling in from today?
I am calling from my apartment in Dumbo in Brooklyn that I just moved to like literally 2 weeks ago. So I'm brand new to Brooklyn.
Amazing. Well, it looks lovely.
Thank you.
To start, do you want to just share a little bit about who you are and what you're currently up to?
Totally. Yeah. So my name is M. Herrera, and I'm an investor at a fund called Knight Ventures. And in a previous life, I have worked at a couple different underrepresented consumer funds, and I had a syndicate and I had a community. And I mean, a lot of the story goes back to I've just been working contract adjacent to the startup space since I was in high school. And that was more of just like the fun of work, but not as much kind of planning out my career. And yeah, I guess we'll go into a lot of it later, but mostly my interests lie in consumer technology and really what are the spaces now that are dominated by people of influence on the internet, and how is that different from when they become influential not on the internet? And yeah, that's a lot of my interest now.
Very cool. To that point, can you tell us a little bit about Night Ventures and
Totally.
what your team is up to there?
Totally. So Knight is a early stage consumer fund out of the company Knight Media, which is a creator management company. But half of our LP base, or just around half, are creators themselves. So not their managers, but the individual creators themselves who want to get exposure to the early stage venture ecosystem. The other half are institutional, kind of regular LPs. And the idea is that we look at consumer enablement companies and enable them with what we call creator go to market. And that looks like the same staffing that we would put into the creators on the talent side, which are people that understand content, both strategy and execution, production, online, offline community, growth, just general virality and influencer relations or creator relations, however you want to call it. But basically, what a lot of the people on my team realize is that a lot of ineffective marketing spend goes to ads and not really online marketing. It's because it's really grown up to be very complex and very hard to understand how to navigate the creator economy or general growth or virality. Those are things that kind of the average everyday person doesn't really think about because they're really the interface of. But the cool thing about Knight as a platform, which is why it would need a lot of sense to kind of build a venture fund under it, is that the platform really is focused around people of influence and also the operators that kind of work in those spaces. So that's kind of what we do. Yeah.
Super, super cool. Can you share an example of an LP on with
Sure,
Night and
sure.
that maybe how they're working with one of your portfolio companies?
Yeah. So the main idea is mostly that. So first of all, we have a lot of, I don't know if I could specifically say exactly who, but there are very high profile individuals like a Mr. Beast, being large LPs kind of within the fund structure. Um, Creators really are within every aspect of Night Media. So there's the creator relations, kind of traditional aspect. There's an incubator, which is built at companies like Beast Burger and Feastables, a lot of these more CPG oriented companies, but then also a lot of SaaS, which is something that Knight's really focused on in the past year, which is also kind of the same time where the venture fund stemmed out of. So it's more of the idea that both the CEO and president of Knight, who are also GPs of the fund, are really the middlemen and operators to this entire space and understand both from the micro to macro influence space, the corporate to startup to everyday individual person kind of interface of the creator economy, but also just like how to navigate these large influential individuals who are half in the operator space as kind of either production managers or small business owners or are really major names within the ecosystem who are being brought into some crazy interfaces. So the relationship really stems from all three GPs to the fund, but not as much the LPs directly. But that's mostly because the same people who are also like on board seats within Knight are also people that are on the roster on the creator side, who are also founders in the incubator side, who are also LPs in the fund. So without saying anything in specific, they're all the same names basically.
Can you share also a little bit more about your team's like investment strategy? You
Yeah,
mentioned you've been looking a little bit more at SaaS companies. Could you tell
yeah,
us like stage, maybe
totally.
geography, whatever you can share there, check size,
Of
those sorts
course,
of
of course.
things?
Of course. So the idea really came about when a year and a half ago we had this whole creator economy, or really during COVID, we had this whole creator economy boom, and people are trying to figure out what are investments in the space, what are companies that are worth building in the space, and really what's the identity of a creator versus an everyday individual person who's consuming media. And that kind of conversation really quickly went to people that had very limited experience kind of in the space, and then eventually poured over to the individuals who were creators. And that was an interesting time, at least for managers, because they didn't know whether to advise them into going into certain kind of business or deals or not. Because really, at the root of a lot of these creators is they care about their communities and they care about their content, and are open to different kinds of opportunities, but don't necessarily have the direct expertise to just kind of feel confident enough to always commit to those things. And I think when you work with a really hands-on, like really like responsible manager, they're going to want to direct you to work with other individuals who also have experience in doing whatever you're supposed to do professionally. And so, kind of the same time that Mr. Beast, who's also an individual that's considered talent within Night, he was kind of doing these Feastables and Feastburger operations that ended up raising venture funding. Those deals kind of came back around to individuals like him. And Reed basically said, I'm having all this exposure within my talent side. They're interested in getting involved. I have kind of an individual expertise within creator, and also managing these individuals of influence. He was getting a lot of insight, considering whatever verticals he was really focusing on at the time. And I think a lot of that was within kind of the creator community, gaming, all of those kinds of interfaces. So that's kind of how it started. So the relationship now is when you approach Night from more of the startup interface, you can either be in a founder or an operator who wants to work with a specific creator. So you can pitch kind of to the Night Labs team, which is the incubator. Or if you kind of are looking for more of that organic marketing or creator go to market, is what we kind of call it, then you interface more with the venture side, which is also really just individual access to read and kind of understanding how to navigate that. And the cool thing about it is I work with people who sometimes say that they have like a domain expertise. But not only does Reed specifically have domain expertise, but also he's in the middle of a lot of really the current conversations of what's going on. And I think as an investor, it's been super cool to see someone who's like very seriously operating, who understands kind of not just the traditional capital structure that would go into VC, but also attention economy and human capital that would go into kind of like the talent support and just understanding how to have a similar domain expertise as a founder. So that's been like kind of the dopest thing. But yeah, that's kind of the interface. So we are a $20 million fund, right? 250 to 500K checks in everything that's consumer facing. So that could be within healthcare, education, real estate. The real thesis of fund of the real thesis of Night as an entire company is understanding where new age consumers are going. And I think everyone's kind of hyper aware of that because we wouldn't all have jobs if it weren't for a lot of individuals who are between ages of 8 and 25, who are the ones who are giving capital and attention to these creators who really employ us. And I think that's kind of the basis of a lot of what we're looking at right now. So examples of that are I'm really interested in personal cybersecurity and kind of how do you protect and restore your accounts what are some security access points that individuals online, whether they're kids, whether they're full adults, whether you work at a corporate or a startup or a small business, how do you secure that your identity maintains to be your own? And that's an example of working with creators where they're kind of more of the heart of the higher stakes within personal cyber has been really insightful because they have multiple people managing their accounts at the same time. They have different accounts for different kinds of purposes. They need insurance, but they don't really know what that would look like. And that's kind of a really good meaty example of how we work with them specifically. Another example is kind of um, so each GP kind of has a different level of expertise and different kinds of interests, but um, the main thing is mostly, and I think this is more of Reed and the talent that's kind of within Night 2, is understanding how to make the creator journey very sustainable as a long-term career. And I think one thing that's really consistent is that you have attention for a certain amount of time. And I think everyone kind of knows that people can get their 15 minutes of fame, but there are really good, talented operators who care a lot about whatever the thing that they're doing is and the community that surrounds them, and are more willing to learn and work around people who know whatever their expertise is that can allow them to build out whatever is actually the next state of whatever they're doing, whether it's going into music, production, becoming a founder, investing. There are so many different verticals individuals are going into. Think about even just a lot of mainstream creators going into athletics and how do you get a coach and a trainer. So that's kind of the idea there. So education is something that's really top of mind, whether that's traditional education or that's kind of like education of specific expertise. And then finally, just like investing strategies or more of like traditional fintech, whether that's real estate or just kind of long-term strategy that can allow for more individuals are getting quick influxes of cash at a younger age. How do you kind of build out the frameworks and tooling that can allow for them to stretch that for multiple decades and potentially build a family off of that? So those are some like really like high level things of what we're looking at, but yeah, a lot of our focus is mostly within education, healthcare, um, finance, and now personal cyber. But that's really just myself, my personal interest.
Very cool. Narrowing down a little bit, can you share any companies that maybe you've
Yeah,
recently invested in or, might be investing in the near future that are
yeah,
exciting to you guys?
yeah. This is also going to go back to kind of one of my favorite. I know I saw your questions list, and one of my favorite women. There's a founder named Tiffany, and she is the CEO and founder of a company called Upkeep Beauty, which is a medical aesthetics booking company. And the story there traditionally was that I was in LA and I looked up, I saw someone had a skywrite of something like $100 free of Botox or something. And I had just came from my orthodontist who said I had TMJ. And I very much, this is like a classic like investor story here, but I looked up at the skywriting. I was like, oh yeah, I'll download it. Went, downloaded it. I was like, okay, I kind of want to get Botox into my jaw. I don't want to ask my friends because it's kind of embarrassing. I don't know if I want to do that for an aesthetic purpose. I don't know if I want to do it for a medical purpose, but regardless, I'm interested. Was on TikTok for a number of hours, kept seeing the same kind of creator go over and over again. And Upkeep again was tagged into all these videos. And I didn't think about it for a decent amount of time, but eventually I had seen Tiffany specifically in the news for something, creating her own individual content as a founder. And I was just like, wow, this girl is really just everywhere that I can possibly look for jaw Botox. So I reached out to her, and she's just so phenomenal at, and really just a perfect example of creator go to market. So some of my favorite founders are really people like Tiffany who are thinking about not just trends, also safety. So the cool thing about Upkeep is that more and more individuals are trying to get these kind of med spa-y Botox fillers, facials, body treatments, etc. And there's a whole back end of licensing and kind of why a lot of traditional beauty booking platforms don't really want to touch these things because it is a partial medical procedure and there's definitely proper licensing that has to happen. But a lot of people are going on to Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, whatever, to see kind of the progress of how certain practitioners are doing these fillers and treatments. But not a lot of them are kind of aware of what's the quality and the traditional standard and how that can potentially affect your health. And that's when you go and you see these different TikToks of saying I got botched and what that looks like. And to the normal person, you're like, oh, I don't want to look like that. But to someone who's kind of trained of that nature, they care more about your actual personal safety for your health. And I think that was something that I hadn't thought of for a long time because I was ready to just walk into a local med spa and just be like, anyone that's able to do like a local anesthesia, just give me a shot and just figure it out. But I think that's kind of one of those nuances where Tiffany's so talented in create a go to market. She's so talented in understanding just safety and trend, and not being scared of kind of working in a space that could potentially be taboo, but also has a ridiculously meaty market. And she's just like a total killer. So love her.
Amazing. It's so true though. I have one friend who's in med school studying dermatology. So I go to her
Yeah,
for all my questions, but like
totally.
there's not enough information out there about
Totally.
that. So very cool. And then
Totally.
would love to hear a little bit more about your story. How did you
Yeah.
end up at Night Ventures? Like I know you worked in VC before.
Yep.
Were you always interested in investing? Tell us how you ended up
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you asking that. I think the story's definitely changed. I think within the past, every night really changed everything for me. So but before I had been kind of dabbling within the startup space, contract working with companies like Girls Who Code and like hashtag built by girls out of AOL. I've been very adjacent to those communities and spaces and working kind of traditionally with people who are around those spaces for a little bit, but I didn't think too much of it. I just really loved the people that were building in those spaces and went throughout college as a computer science journalism major. I went to Northeastern in Boston. I did the classic kind of college experience. I tried my best to do that, but honestly, I was a little bit bored. And the story goes is that Northeastern, for people who are familiar or not familiar, that it's a co-op oriented school. So basically, you take semesters where you're working and semesters where you're studying. And that was really the main reason why I ended up going to Northeastern. But I just got one little itch from one co-op, and I never basically wanted to go back to school because I just loved working. And so I'd started at the Boston Globe, worked from brand to kind of the data facing side, and really fell in love with storytelling in terms of how a regular person is really interpreting this piece of media. Why are they choosing to kind of spend $30+ on seeing this name every single day? And who are they really trusting? Is it that they're trusting the name or are they trusting the individual person? I thought from department to department, and I worked with city to the love section to really every section. It became really clear to me that the individual people were the ones that were worth the $30 to people, to everyday Bostonians. And so I did that, continued that job for a while, ended up popping contract NBC. And then it kind of COVID hit, and a friend of mine had referred me to join a fellowship that was out of a student facing fund. And originally, I had no idea what venture capital was. And she was like, look, they're looking for someone who understands media, who understands kind of like the R&D side of what companies like from smaller papers to a Boston Globe to a large media company are looking at. And they just want someone to kind of cover that. So I did the interview. My friend just fed me answers to questions that they knew that they would ask. And I ended up joining, and I thought it was really interesting as a concept, but I still didn't get what would really qualify me as a younger person to know what's worth investment or not. And I think that is something that still stays with me now, 2.5 years later. But I was just more interested than confident. So came into it during COVID. I was home with my parents. They're a little older, so I stayed home with them for around 10 months and ended up not going back to school for a while. And that was really my grind time. So when I did my introduction into this fellowship, I really quickly noticed because I was around Girls Who Code and I taught Girls Who Code and I was in the BBG ecosystem. I just noticed that a lot of the girls weren't really talking to each other. And I wasn't exposed to this kind of general culture of startup versus traditional tech. Because a lot of when I was younger, I was focused on, going to like back when Tumblr was hot or like Twitter or a lot of these big tech companies, they have onboardings and they have kind of culture checkers to make sure that things are certain ways. But startup was a totally different ballgame. So I ended up kind of one-on-one meeting a lot of the girls and doing my little thing, getting on. And I'm a Gemini sun and moon, so I get way too friendly with people. And I started introducing them to each other. And what I really quickly noticed is I had two really good friends of mine that were both guys in the space. And the best advice that they gave me was don't focus on the operational aspect of being a scout for this fund. Focus on the social aspect. And I think that's a super raw, honest thing to hear for young people is like you are surrounded, especially if you're going to a private institution, and especially if you're going to these fellowships, you're surrounded by probably the smartest people that you'll be around for years. And focusing obviously on the tactical executional points is really important. And it got me in trouble for not as much focusing on it. But realistically, I knew that it was an opportunity that wasn't necessarily paying me. So that was some real advice that I took to heart. So I started making these intros. There were other funds that also had student fellowship programs. And I was like, why not go and talk to them? So long story short, started scooping them up from there and got us all in a Zoom room at some point, and we gave ourselves a name. And yeah, the rest is history. We ended up becoming a collection of kind of these student oriented fund women, people who were summer analysts at larger funds. We try to find some fangirls that we just predicted wanted to go more into startups. So we'd look at like literally LinkedIn, scrape that up and get them on the phone and be like, hey, don't go into Fang, come join the dark side with us. And then also I was just meeting kind of along the way some women who were significantly younger than the average founder's age who were raising a bunch of money, and you would never even know their age. But they wanted to meet other women that were just as smart as they were. So had that, ended up building out a syndicate when a lot of girls were coming to me and saying, hey, I just read this thing on Twitter and it's about a syndicate. And it was from a girl named Paige Finn Daughtry, who's now a really good friend of mine. And I got on Twitter and I kept tweeting at this girl. And I was like, I have no idea what this stuff is. I'm too lazy to read it. Can you please get on the phone with me? And she's an absolutely amazing person. So she got on and taught me how to kind of navigate this space. And yeah, from there, I ended up doing insights and selling them and then deciding to go into venture. So then I worked at BBG Ventures, which is a fund that came out of, so there was built by girls out of AOL. And then the individuals who are running that ended up building out BBG Ventures, which is a women's focused fund. And then did the same thing over at Harlem Capital, which is underserved founder fund. And yeah, and then I ended up making my way to Knight. So that's the long story long.
I love it. Well, you casually dropped your Twitter, but you have a big following and you're a creator
Thank you.
yourself. So
Thank you.
tell
Thank
me
you.
more about how you started that journey, and also back to your point of the advice of being social. Like, do you feel like
Yeah.
you've been social a lot through that account? Like, what have you
Oh yeah.
tactically done to be social?
Oh yeah. So the story really goes, and I had done an interview a couple of months ago where I accidentally dropped this piece of information, and now I feel like it's natural for me to drop it again, so I'll drop it one more time. I used to manage One Direction and Ariana Grande's stan accounts on Twitter, and I was completely anonymous. That was probably when I was like 14 to 18.
How did you get that opportunity?
Um, that girl, I mean, I feel like if anyone was kind of in that space at that time, it's not even like an opportunity. Like it truly is like you're just saying the raunchiest nonsense as a 14-year-old girl. You're like going through puberty, you're like going to like the events themselves and having opinions on the music. And I mean, if you kind of take a peek into stan culture, I don't know if you're a stan of anyone particularly, but I was a major fangirl for the majority of my life. And I had really strict parents. I was always home, super studious. So I was just always home doing homework and then go to my room and just be on my whatever ridiculous latest small device it was. And I had a lot of friends that were in school that were also secretly fans. And I feel like being a fan of anything is kind of a little bit embarrassing. It's always a little bit cringe. So no one really, especially not in middle school and high school, wanted to talk about that publicly. So I made some of my closest relationships back then from people that were in school who didn't really want to publicly talk about being associated with kind of especially One Direction at the time. And so yeah, I started doing that for a bit, did the whole fan fiction thing, met people online who this is like really bad. Like if I had kids, I would not let them do this because you're just like talking to strangers. But I ended up making it into like a small business and it was kind of dope at the time. But it really was that is the experience hands down that allowed for me to have the confidence to open a personal Twitter. And that was back in 2013, which I was literally 13 years old, which is so embarrassing and very cringe. But that syntax is something that I think, and I appreciate everyone that follows me. They've let me kind of experience as a grown adult. And I think that's something that psychologically a lot of parents are curious about is now we have these younger people speaking in a certain kind of syntax. Where do they get it from? They get it from the amount of time they're spending online. And it's not really anything that's going to affect them long term, but it's something that really is like uh, it's a sign of being a part of the online community. And so, yeah, so in terms of socializing and stuff, we had COVID. I was online. I was connecting with a lot of the girls from those groups publicly. We knew that it would be really important for us to show younger students and people who weren't directly in that space that we all were connected and knew each other. So that was a conscious choice amongst multiple, especially investors. And yeah, and then I ended up dropping out of school, kind of bopping around for a little bit and meeting a lot of people who were very generous whenever I'd post stuff that was actually intellectually curious. They'd say, "Oh, that girl that has a really funny syntax actually has something interesting to say." And that gave me a lot of confidence going forward. So now I think when I think about my Twitter, I've been super duper fortunate in continuing that syntax with reactions to content that I probably would never organically write about. And I think the funny thing about that is like humor is the easiest emotion to process. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm funny, but I think the syntax that I speak in sometimes can be really funny, and it's really important for me, especially for younger women, to see that it's okay to say like slay on very serious topics that like you probably shouldn't. But I've been bitten with the bug of like I don't really care that much, and I thought it was really important to have someone be in the space that's comfortable using that part of my personality. Because I also think, and my last point of it is like the whole concept of authenticity online and stuff. I mean, if you think about full-time creators right now, they have their own individual community of people who are okay being themselves publicly online. And I think it's really hard for people who are professional individuals to tap into that level of authenticity. And I think, especially in my one on one conversations and how I bring myself in person, I think the acceptance of people within my Twitter of knowing that I'm like that and I have a certain kind of humor and I, can talk about Harry Styles on my own professional account. Like that stuff is crazy. I never thought just like my mom hates it. You know what I mean? Like I have two Colombian parents who are like, "What are you doing?" But I think it's kind of a sign of the times where individuals really more respect that you can show up as your individual self. And I think that's kind of my encouragement, especially for younger women, is that there is like that there will be a wave of individuals who are really, really smart and can show up saying whatever they want and wearing whatever they want. And yeah, so that's kind of now my conscious choice going into it is making sure I can be as hyper feminine and ridiculous as possible.
Amazing and super cool that you were able to do that. And it's awesome. Two follow-up questions.
Hit me.
One, were your parents okay with your Twitter account at 13? And two, how did you decide and like be okay with I'm gonna drop out of school, I'm gonna just pursue my career full time?
Yeah, my parents didn't know about my Twitter account until I was in maybe sophomore year of high school. So probably 2 or 3 years in. And how my mom found out is we had a program in my high school, and I grew up in Long Island. And it was meant for traditional science research. Like my sister, it was one of those classic, like my older sister did it, so I wanted to do it. And then I actually had to sit down and realize, oh my God, I have to do research on something. And I knew that I was really interested in data. I thought it was really cool. I was always like trying to play around with stuff, but like I wasn't really that good, so it didn't really matter. Um, I ended up doing Girls Who Code around that same time. And when I was kind of doing that as a student, a lot of the stuff that we'd bond on as a class was our stands. And I realized a lot of those girls were having stan accounts, and that was really my connection. So within my general high school population, I would never talk about that. My friends, we would talk about it, and then I kind of had this exposure on the startup side. I was like, oh, this is sick. They also really identify with this stuff. So I ended up doing for that research class. I wanted to pursue the idea of younger individuals having a secret online persona and online communities where individuals don't have to choose their identity yet. And it was super obvious to me because I didn't know how to identify with a lot of things around that age. I hated onboarding for a lot of social apps because I was like, I got to pick all this stuff. I got to join these communities. What if they judge me because I like, love like Ricky Martin and people think he's like lame and like all this stuff that was like J-Lo like kind of stinks, but like I kind of love her music, so I want to follow her. You know what I mean? So I was really just overthinking a lot of this stuff, but now thinking about it, it's actually really like real that people do look at who you're following. At least at the time of like 2015, people cared about who people were following. So I had that, and kind of the moment my mom realized it is I went into this professor at NYU's office and I proposed kind of doing both psychological and sociological research within online communities for people who are kind of, still kids essentially. And I shared my story and kind of the Girls Who Could experience and saying these are things that, people are now creating these personas younger and younger. And he basically laughed me out of the office and was like, nobody's doing that. Like, I have a daughter and she's 9 years old. And I was like, I swear to you, she has an account and you have no idea. I was like, this is so embarrassing, but I had a like online boyfriend on WeWorld at like 11. And I was like, no, like, I'm telling you, like, I have no idea which I'm saying this now as like an 11-year-old or whatever, I was 15-year-old girl. It's like, no, I'm telling you, like, there are people that your daughter interact with that she has no idea who they are. And like, that's just how people work nowadays. But my mom ended up leaving that room with me and being like, oh my God, like you're talking to strangers. And I was like, no, 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 but they're not like strangers. They're like my age strangers. And it was just a really interesting disconnect there. But so that was kind of how she found out that I had it. My dad could not possibly care less. Like he just knew that I loved Harry Styles. Like whatever, I don't really care. But then kind of now the professional relationship has been really interesting, because they come from corporate backgrounds, both of them, and they're both from Colombia, so they're both um, yeah, I mean, they have very traditional mindsets. So, especially during COVID, my mom was realizing that a lot of professional VCs were following me, and I was very vocal about diversity and inclusion, especially being empowered to work with funds that focused on that. And so, for me, socially, I felt, and professionally, I felt empowered to talk about a lot of these subjects, especially being a younger woman in the space. And my mom would totally freak out and she didn't understand this like physical digital footprint and how that would affect my professional career. And I think that I've been super privileged again to like be close to people who I knew would come at bat with me. But I think that that's a real conversation where it could definitely long term affect a person's professional career. But I was so like excited just to have conversation with people who I thought were just more plugged in and smarter than I was about these topics that I cared about. I just didn't really care. But it was a huge fight. It would be fights. Well, I would say some ridiculous nonsense. And my mom to this day hates a lot of it. Um but that's okay. It's not for the faint of heart.
I have a similar conversation going with my parents. They don't totally
Oh,
understand what I'm doing online either.
You're
So
you are doing, I mean, I've been following your account for now like 2 weeks, and I had two friends of mine like mention you, and I was like, oh yeah, like I gotta check her out. And then I did. I was like, your content is so good.
thank you.
So you should show this to your mom and say, this random girl who probably says way worse stuff than I do says that this is stamp of approval. But I mean, it gives you such amazing distribution, especially at this point of your career. So I think it's dope. Just saying.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I completely agree. I think putting yourself out there online, honestly, this is all new to me in the last year, but it's opened up so many opportunities. So I
yeah,
totally agree that it's just so
totally.
worth it. as scary
Totally.
as it can be at first.
So the reason why I dropped out of school was mostly for working, like 98% of it. I think that something really snapped. I think everyone kind of had like a little snap during COVID. I was just like, I just have always loved working, um, which is kind of a maybe a deeper issue, but I loved people. I loved um, stories, and I am very fickle about problems. Um, I usually will approach problems saying that everyone else in the room probably knows more than I do, and I think that's from my journalism training, which is very different from a lot of the way that VC works right now. So that's great. But I think it allows for me to kind of have a more holistic view of things, and um, I think right now one of the things that I'm interested in investment is kind of understanding trade schools, understanding co-ops, and understanding what is the real pressure of people who are graduating college right now in terms of getting to their first job. And I've heard some crazy statistics of people that never had professional experiences leaving private institutions. Last year, 40% of students dropped out of college just last year alone, and around just thinking around a quarter of private universities of private university students dropped out. So there are some crazy dropout rates going on now. And I thought what was really interesting is I was meeting a lot of really smart people that weren't in school. And I wanted to go kind of figure out a lot of these issues. And I basically was like, let me just put off school as much as I possibly can. And it got to a point where I had taken specifically these venture jobs, and I realized that it's selling a lot of my social life and my, um, when I meet people nowadays, it's not as much for, um, the way that a traditional person who's not working in like a community oriented job would. It's really like making introductions and all that kind of that's stuff that, at least for me at that age, I just couldn't see a world where I could balance, you know, being in a sorority and going back to school and hanging out with my friends and talking about stuff that wasn't work. So basically, I was the problem. And I was super fortunate to be able to be selected to work with these fund managers who were all amazing. And it was really clear to me that I had this trajectory, and I had this thesis kind of when I spoke before about the virus. Um, I have it online now, but we ended up kind of doing a bunch of surveys that was focused on basically what do younger women care about, and something that's not brand focused. Like, are there actual products that would help an experience of a young person in the modern era? And we started focusing on, at the time, this was the thesis of the syndicate, kind of like investing as a form of curation, and kind of what is investing, if it's just traditional capital, if it's attention, if it's people that you know. And that was it's so funny because I actually quoted Night Ventures like in that thesis. um, but what are the tools that can allow for an individual person to consciously provide capital, consciously provide attention, and individuals to whatever they're looking at? And then also kind of that early future of work, pre-professional to professional transition. So what's going to allow for more people to click and have long-term relationships in jobs? So they're not doing 3 to 6 months and then switching from job to job. They're really connecting with their managers. They're really feeling fulfilled. And not just going to school just to kind of sit in their parents' place and applying to jobs for a year and a half, 2 years, which I saw a lot of my friends doing. So that's kind of that was the syndicate. And really I dropped out for the syndicate and working at BBG. So yeah,
Amazing.
that's
Well,
the
you
story.
followed what you were excited about and you leaned into an opportunity, which I think is amazing advice.
Oh yeah, I was really YOLOing it at the time. I also moved to Miami for a little bit. I moved to LA for a little bit. It was your girl was having a time.
Nice. I also was in school during COVID and those
Yeah.
Zoom classes, it was just like, what am I getting out of this? So I can imagine there might have been a little bit of that.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll tell you something that I've been really thinking about. I don't know if there are actually traditionally programs for dropouts. I would love to see a university. I know that Northeastern was incredibly open minded for me, kind of taking time off and leave and stuff, but I'm seeing more people who want to explore whatever opportunity is in front of them. And especially now with individuals being creators and kind of this dropout culture, there are more opportunities for younger people than ever before. there's really no baked in kind of solution for I want to take off time to go pursue this thing professionally. So one, that's a trend that I hope that more colleges are open-minded to. And then two, I would love to see a top tier school really bring back some college dropouts that maybe have been out for a year, 2 years, to allow them to do more research oriented classes. An example right now is I'm doing a lot of like long form writing, and I would totally pay to go back to school part time at night or something like that. Like night school or something like that. I would love to do that, and really just contribute any insights that I'm having within my own job, to like a professional research institution. I think that would be dope. I'm seeing a lot of really young people wanting to do more research than just going back and kind of taking, an econ 101.
Yeah.
Not to say that that's not important, but they're obviously they kind of know that stuff at that point. So those are two trends that I'm kind of waiting for in terms of dropout culture is, letting kids kind of explore these things professionally and baking that in. And then also, if there could be programs where people can go back and just do research, use those research aspects of a lot of these institutions. That would be dope. I think that'd make research really hot.
I do think there's going to be a ton of change coming with education, just considering,
Oh
how
yeah,
virtual we've gone. Like there's so many different opportunities coming. So very excited
totally,
as well to
totally.
see how that changes. Do you have any kind of like advice that you would share to diverse founders, diverse investors, or anyone that's
Yeah,
like trying to be a creator in this
yeah.
space?
Okay, love this question. I think first, founders versus investors versus operators. I think playing in the like traditional Silicon Valley startup culture is very different power dynamic wise with all three individuals. I think it's super unrealistic sometimes to say that people who are online who are founders versus people who are online who are investors, they're going to have similar amounts of success because sometimes when you have these digital footprints, you know, these footprints will bring judgment. And I think that that's kind of the persona that succeeds is being open to that level of judgment. And I've said some pretty messed up stuff and stuff that I wouldn't agree with. And I think depending on whatever your audience is, there are people. I mean, I'm super fortunate where I think the people that follow me are open to me sharing that I've said stupid, dumb things as a kid and want to see me grow as an individual person. But I think that's a little bit harder, especially for people who are older, who have a whole career worth of what we'd call content for them. It's life experiences and stuff that they've shared online and offline. And so I think that's one. There's definitely a age difference, pros and cons. And then two, kind of going back to those dynamics of being a founder and being a VCs. I think that there's still the stigma of both individuals spending time online and putting what they want out there versus working. And I think that at least from a VC's perspective, 'cause that's really I think what I could talk about mostly is um, this is basically depending on where you work, obviously it looks very different, but a lot of this job is platform and distribution and getting to people as early as possible and getting unique insights and kind of, wiggling that either throughout your fund as a thesis point or externally. But regardless, you have to get access to everyone at any point. And I think that stigma is stupid from an investor standpoint. And I think any managing partner that doesn't want for their, especially junior VCs, to be as online and present as possible is missing out on a KPI. And at least within our fund, I have this, I have this framework that I say with my partners is basically I can get anyone within the startup ecosystem that's on Twitter on the phone within 2 days. And as the year goes on, I want to get that down to hours to minutes. And I think that's kind of something that I wouldn't see why, uh, especially a business where you have to have access to people as early as possible and have a strong reach of trust as early as possible. Why you wouldn't want for that to be individual facing. And my push, I think, especially to managing partners, is if you weren't to do that, then don't hire the person. If you can't trust them in every single conversation, because traditionally how it used to be is going to the bar and hanging out and going out with people, going to shows, doing that whole traditional kind of investment banking thing to acquire trust within other investors and founders. And now it's kind of you could do that at a lot faster pace and honestly a lot cheaper. So that's kind of my push to managing. to juniors, especially underrepresented VCs, is like we don't take up space. And I think that's the hardest thing, especially going into the creator space. It's been really, really difficult. And I'm super vocal about this. Seeing a lot of these conversations going to represented individuals, and their narrative versus my narrative is very different, because I remember a lot of the beauty creator businesses starting in the early 2010s, and I think that level of kind of uh, that was the true transition, at least in my eyes, as a person, of the creator economy going from just being a person of influence to being a true business. And there were flops and there were successes, and I still think the influencer versus creator discussion is something that is super taboo, especially in the creator space, because I do think that at least a majority of women, are still bucketed under that influencer space versus kind of the traditional Mr. Beast creator space. And so that's kind of something that, as an example, just within my own space, that I knew I had to start kind of pushing a little bit more on the creator lens, because my experience just as a consumer, and now as a creator, is entirely different from someone like one of my GPs. And I think that that's the most obvious thing for me, at least in the creator space. And I think that's kind of distributed amongst most of the consumer facing spaces, at least, is that a lot of these underrepresented experiences um, aren't presented, and I think that that's just like a miss. So yeah, I just don't want to be googling up, especially consumer facing. That's another thing, is that consumer facing versus deep tech funds and stuff. Do I think it's necessarily super realistic to say that uh, if you're an intern at a deep tech fund that doesn't do any consumer practice at all, that you should be kind of the face of it? No, I think that's kind of hard um, to do, because, yeah, I mean, I kind of get it, but also, why not? Like, who's to say that I can't think of someone that works full time at a fund right now, at a deep tech fund. I don't have like a personal connection to deep tech right now, at least as a consumer, and I can't really relate to any of those partners right now. So like, why not? But I think the main thing is that there are narratives that are dominated by one kind of experience right now, across especially the consumer space. So if you have something to say, like, why not say it? And yeah, I mean, that's that's kind of my little qualm. And then I think the last thing too is that there has to be more representation on a lot of really strong operators within the consumer space. And for me, consumer and creator are the exact same thing. So an example being, I have a friend of mine who works for a really famous VC, and she's a total killer. Like, I've never seen anyone manage um, kind of his creator oriented content business as well as she does. And I think, especially just in general, a lot of the people who are operating on these creators are underrepresented people, a lot of them. And I would love to see someone kind of come up and say, I work for so and so, and this is what my work looks like, and this is how you can kind of also be in that space, because I think it's still not really spoken about. But yeah, those are my different phases on it. But I think, especially for an investor who's underrepresented, um, I think a lot of the questions I get from people are, should I niche in a specific space right out of school? Um, I would say, unless you traditionally like were thinking about becoming a practitioner in medicine or deep tech or any of those kind of more specialty oriented things where you'd have to do years of schooling for, consumer, a lot of it is just, you know, there's a lot of innovation that has to happen in the venture space. So if you have access to the job already, like, niche, like, why not have a thesis and kind of go all in onto it? And if you're wrong, like, who cares? I think a lot of specifically the investor space, is open to being wrong. If you think about just in the past 2 years since COVID, a lot of VCs have been going off of trends, regardless if they're deep tech, late stage funds, early stage funds. Everyone's writing waves and everyone's writing trends. So if someone can kind of be an originator of these trends, like we have right now, a lot of these implosions of different spaces, and I think it's just a natural cycle of how these ecosystems work. And it's not really to blame to the person who wrote the first crypto thread on Twitter. No one's going back and blaming that person for a lot of the chaos that's going on within that space right now. It really is just the nature of this ecosystem. So yeah, I mean, I'm someone who loves kind of the idea of just throwing it to the wall, but I think there has to be more spaces, and people really digging into why they personally care about what they're talking about. I think that that's super important.
Where can we find you? Where can we find your team?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. My handle is Emily Herrera, but the first E is an X. It's because of Tumblr. Don't make fun of me. I'm literally an old woman. Um, but yeah, if you look up just M Herrera, I'm sure you can find me doing a little sassy photo going in there. But also just go to my website, emilyherrera.com. I have a lot of my writing up there, and it's very messy and it's very scrapbooky. That's because I haven't kind of formally published that stuff yet. But if anyone's interested in kind of those frameworks that I'm working on, you can check that out there. And then my team, nightventures.com or night.co to kind of see the entirety of Night. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining. I'll make sure to link all those things, obviously, in the podcast. And it was so cool to meet
Beautiful.
you, and you've had such a cool journey, and I appreciate you
Thank you.
sharing.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it a lot.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Future is Female podcast. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. See you next time.